This is the Global News Podcast from the BBC World Service. Hello, I'm Emilio San Pedro, and in the early hours of Sunday, the 4th of August, these are our main stories. At least 19 people are reported killed in another mass shooting in the United States, this time in a shopping center in the city of El Paso. Hundreds of protesters arrested in Moscow at the latest rally calling for free and fair elections. And large protests in Hong Kong as well, where police used tear gas and baton charges against pro-democracy demonstrators who'd been hurling bricks at a police station. Also in this podcast, tourists and pilgrims are rushing to leave the Kashmir Valley on the orders of the Indian government, which has warned of possible terror attacks. And how Detroit, Michigan, once seen as the epitome of the Rust Belt, is making an impressive economic comeback. The city of El Paso in Texas, right on the border with Mexico, has long been considered one of America's safest cities. However, on Saturday, it was the scene of a violent mass shooting in which at least 19 people are reported to have been killed after a gunman opened fire on shoppers at a Walmart store. Hospitals in the city say more than 20 people have been injured. Sergeant Robert Gomez is a spokesman with the El Paso Police Department.
We do have one person in custody. I can confirm that it is a white male in his 20s. I don't have any other information on that right now. The estimates of the shoppers at Walmart were between 1 and 3,000 with 100 employees present. It is back to school and the Walmart was at capacity when the shootings occurred. I can't confirm there have been fatalities. I can't not confirm how many. There have been injuries.
I asked our U.S. correspondent, Peter Bowes, what was known so far.
As we've just heard, events are moving very quickly, and we do now understand through the BBC's partner in the States, CBS, that 19 people have been killed, that the suspect, a white man in his 20s, has been taken into custody, and the police described him being taken into custody without incident, and that none of the police officers involved fired their weapons. So it looks as if this man did not put up a fight. Taken into custody without incident was the phrase that was used. We know that some other people are in hospital. We had the initial figure of 22. It's not entirely clear whether that includes those who've lost their lives, but certainly people being treated for their injuries, some described as being in a critical condition, and their ages ranging from 4 months to senior citizens. That the scene, this shopping mall, the very busy Saturday, some witnesses talking about how they were shopping for their children, preparing for the new school term, buying clothes and supplies that they would need. Others describing the panic and the chaos in the moments after the shooting started.
And there's been a lot of reaction to this on social media and from leading figures in the U.S.
There clearly has been a lot of reaction. The president has tweeted about this, Mr. Trump being kept informed as developments change. He tweeted that these were terrible shootings. He said the reports were very bad, many people killed. Clearly that tweet coming before we had confirmation, at least through CBS, of how many people we believe to have died. Others, of course, as you can imagine, taking to social media to express their exasperation, their concern, their anger that shooting after shooting, nothing ever seems to change. And that is the tenor of the debate. And a lot of people referring to the sequence of events that we always seem to get in cases like this. We get the panic, and then we get the dealing with the situation and dealing with grief, and then move on without anything significantly happening in terms of politicians coming together. And that's what it would take, politicians from both sides coming together to agree on possible laws that could stop this kind of thing happening in the future.
Peter Bowes. And as we record this podcast, we've just heard that the BBC's US partner network CBS is naming the gunman as 21-year-old Patrick Crucius. To Moscow now. It's been another day of protests in the Russian capital. We heard people there shouting shame as a protester was being held by the police. Hundreds of people were arrested in the demonstrations against the disqualification of a number of opposition candidates from standing in local elections. A prominent opposition politician was among those taken away by police in riot gear. Lyubov Sobol was bundled into a police van. She had this message for the police. She can be heard there asking the police why they're putting on their helmets and why they're afraid of a girl who's on the 21st day of a hunger strike. About 30 would-be candidates, many allies of the jailed opposition politician Alexei Navalny, have been barred from the elections. Our correspondent in Moscow, Sarah Rainsford, explained the mood of the protesters.
They're very defiant as far as the protesters themselves are concerned. Now, don't forget, they were warned not to come out today. They were told in advance that this was going to be an illegal protest and that they faced arrest, they faced detention. And of course, last week, we saw scenes where people were very brutally beaten with batons by the riot police. Now, today, it seems that the police have adopted a different tactic. There are huge numbers of them on the streets. They're wearing all their body armour and they're detaining large numbers of the protesters. But from what I saw, it wasn't violent today. They were swooping in and dragging people away to police vans, but by and large, people were not being beaten. I'm not saying it didn't happen. I'm just saying that on the whole, this was much more peaceful. But still, 600 was the last number I saw, the official number from police, for the number of protesters detained, basically, for walking around the city boulevard ring, the ring closest to the centre of Moscow city.
And tell us more about why this exclusion of these candidates from local elections has sparked such anger.
Well, it's been a real surprise, I think even possibly for the candidates themselves. Certainly these elections don't normally get a lot of attention. They pass without notice mostly. The Duma, the local parliament, hasn't historically had an awful lot of power. But these opposition activists have really changed things by trying to run, by being barred from running, and then protesting about it. They've managed to bring pretty big crowds out onto the streets, 20,000 last week and in the previous days. And people who, when I talk to them, they say, look, we want to be reckoned with, we want to be heard. We're fed up of a country where we don't have any political representation. Now, this is because from the Kremlin down, essentially, under Vladimir Putin, the sort of genuine opposition here, liberal opposition voices, have been squeezed gradually from all sorts of power, all bodies of power. And this is an attempt by some opposition voices to change that from the very bottom, from the local city council here in Moscow. They've been blocked and people have come out in large numbers to protest about that.
Our correspondent in Moscow, Sarah Rainsford. There have also been clashes between protesters and police in Hong Kong after a day of rallies on Saturday held by both pro-democracy and pro-Beijing protesters. It's the 9th consecutive weekend that the territory has seen protests despite increasingly stern warnings from China's central government about the unrest. Our correspondent, Stephen McDonnell, was there when police charged at protesters and fired tear gas.
We just came from the Tsim Sha Tsui police compound where hundreds of riot police charged with batons, shields at high speed while firing tear gas in order to clear thousands of protesters from the front of that police compound. Earlier, these more hardcore pro-democracy activists had been throwing bricks and other projectiles into the police station, smashing up cars using large bamboo poles to smash up vehicles, shining lasers into the windows of the police station, and also graffitiing the front of it. The police issued a warning and said, if you don't disperse, we're going to come out hard with tear gas, and that's exactly what they did. This was after a largely peaceful march, and that seems to be the pattern of how things are going here. And funnily enough, was happening, at least the peaceful part of the march, at the same time as on Hong Kong Island. There was a pro-Beijing rally. They were defending the police, saying that the police actions have been necessary and understandable, and the police should come in even harder on them.
Now, Stephen, this is the 9th consecutive weekend of protests. Why are tensions still running so high?
Because the protesters are just becoming more and more emboldened. They're turning up to these rallies with their gas masks, with their goggles, with their makeshift shields, with their helmets, and it's harder for the police to clear them out. They don't seem to mind when they get warnings to get out of the street or not turn up to a certain area to protest. They still come. And despite the fact that the black-clad hardcore demonstrators with their helmets and the like are the ones fighting with the police in the streets, you're seeing all these other protests going on all around Hong Kong. And one of the reasons is, when you think about it, if you're 20 years old now, in 2047, when Hong Kong is fully returned to Beijing, in that there'll be no one country, two systems, as it's called. It'll be one system. It'll just be part of communist China without the independent judiciary, without, a free press. So this is why they've decided it's time to fight now. They're hoping that somehow or other it can guarantee a free, and they would hope, a democratic future for them.
Stephen McDonnell in Hong Kong. A few years ago, the U.S. city of Detroit in Michigan was bankrupt. Once home to 2 million people, the population had dwindled to 800,000. Whole streets had rows of shuttered housing. But today, the downtown area is buzzing, jobs are returning, and the city is making a cultural and economic comeback. This report from our North America editor, John Sopel.
Detroit itself, of course, became a byword for failure, industrial decline, the Rust Belt. But it's coming back.
All right, you here to sign up for a job? Okay, we'll get you in right now. It's just about to start, so you just signed up.
This is a Baptist church in the suburbs of Detroit, and what's on offer here are thousands of jobs.
We're at the Detroit at Work FCA Job Readiness event, and we're getting Detroiters ready for jobs at Fiat Chrysler and other opportunities.
And Fiat Chrysler, how many jobs are they offering?
Oh, close to 5,000. And Detroiters
that's a lot.
Yeah, and Detroiters get the first crack at the jobs.
We're just walking into a room in the church hall, and you've got rows of people now lining to queue up.
So, we are going to get through this together. Are you guys ready?
The mayor of Detroit is Mike Duggan. He's come here to talk about the opportunities opening up for the city.
Today, we're getting people ready. The first assembly plant anywhere in America outside of the South in the last 10 years is being built in Detroit. And so now we got to get 5,000 people.
But he also told me the Democrats must avoid the political mistakes of last time round.
You've got a lot of people who are making $11 and $12 an hour working in restaurants and in hotels who are in a room right now looking to get into assembly jobs that pay $60,000 a year. And what people want to know is, how can we get more of those jobs here, and how can I have an opportunity to do them? And I think whoever delivers on that message is going to be successful in Michigan.
Were you surprised that Michigan went to Trump in 2016?
You could feel it coming. I don't think the Democratic Party in 2016 spoke to the aspirations of blue-collar workers who wanted to work hard and improve their standard of living. I don't think you'll see Democrats make that mistake this year, and certainly Joe Biden has spoken to that issue his entire career, and I think he'll do extremely well in Michigan.
I've been here all my life, and I just see it is getting better. It's the last couple of years, I just see it growing. A lot of people coming back. They building, rebuilding a lot of stuff.
Okay, so who gets the credit? The mayor or Donald Trump?
The mayor.
What do you think of Donald Trump?
I don't like speaking on him. He ain't even worth my time to talk about.
I see Trump like this. You know, you go to a wedding and the cake is absolutely beautiful and it's disgusting. And that's how most politicians are. They're polished and they're disgusting inside. Him, he's a cake that could be slightly neater, but absolutely delicious. And that is the analogy I would draw between Trump and other politicians. So I love the guy.
The porn stars, the Playboy models. I mean, does that disqualify him?
No, because I think that we didn't hire him to be our pastor. We hired him to be the bull in the china shop, to go in there, tear it down, and rebuild it. We don't expect him to go out with our daughters. That's not why we want him there. We want him to do the job for the American people, and that's what he's doing.
He was the outsider. He was the person who was looking at the system and saying, it's rotten, I'm going to make it better. He can't say that now. In 2020, he's defending his record.
And what a record he has to defend. I'm like, he's created 6 million jobs. We have 500,000 manufacturing jobs. If anyone remembers, when Obama was in office, he more or less told Americans, forget about manufacturing jobs. They're not coming back. Well, guess what? Under President Trump, they're back.
The long and tortuous path to the White House will pass through Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and yes, here in Michigan as well. But it's a state divided. Those in the cities who feel Donald Trump has done nothing for them, and the people here in Macomb County who feel that Donald Trump, for all his faults, has been true to his word.
John Sopel. Still to come in this podcast, we look at the legacy of the German scientist and thinker Alexander von Humboldt, who's enjoying a comeback after decades out of the limelight.
He is this absolutely crazy guy who, comes from an aristocratic Prussian family and kind of gives up his life of privilege to go on this mad journey where he spends 5 years in Latin America and he paddles down the Orinoco and get deep, deep in the rainforest when no white people really went.
The Russian authorities say they've managed to slow the spread of the wildfires raging across Siberia. 30,000 square kilometers have been affected. Satellite images show that the smoke has drifted as far as Alaska and Canada. Environmental groups have spoken of an ecological catastrophe that could speed up global warming. Our Moscow correspondent Steve Rosenberg traveled to one of the regions hit by the fires.
I'm driving through a Siberian forest. Some people from the local village have agreed to show me what the situation is regarding the Siberian wildfires. And I'm being bumped around in what is, in effect, a military-style Russian truck. But you need one of these to reach such a remote area. I'd been told that the fire here had been extinguished, but it's still smouldering. Clouds of smoke are rising from the earth. I can see flames too. Forestry workers armed with pumps are trying to keep the situation under control. But fighting fires in Siberia this summer is particularly difficult. Unusually hot weather and strong winds have spread fire across 3 million hectares. An area the size of Belgium is burning. Today, Russia said that 10,000 people were battling the wildfires. The army has been deployed too. But in the forest I visited, firefighter Gennady told me that sometimes fires in Siberia don't burn out until the snow falls. Russia may have to let nature take its course.
Steve Rosenberg. Every year, more than 100,000 people take part in a pilgrimage in Indian-administered Kashmir, visiting the Amarnath cave, one of the holiest sites in Hinduism. But this year's pilgrimage has been abruptly called off after the Indian government warned there was a threat of militant attacks from Pakistan. Thousands of people have been boarding buses out of the Kashmir Valley region following the government's advice to leave immediately. Our correspondent, Riaz Mazwar Khan, is following developments from Srinagar in Kashmir. I asked him what else the authorities were saying about the threat.
Suddenly, they have discovered and claimed that they had intelligence intercepts of huge arms and ammunition along 2 routes of the pilgrimage. And yesterday, I was in the press conference. A top army official and top police officials were there. They said that after a search operation, they found US-made sniper rifle and a Pakistani-made landmine, so the threat is real. And that's why the administration was prompted to issue an advisory asking all the pilgrims, tourists, as well as the students who, study here in different educational institutes to leave immediately. So it caused panic.
How is the evacuation going?
The day has been too chaotic to understand what's going on because, the order was so brazen in language. So everybody was so disturbed that they were packing in haste. And we saw quite early in the morning students packing their bags, boarding buses. Airport was jammed. The highway was jammed. Everybody was leaving Kashmir, which was leaving a psychological impact upon those who live here, who are Kashmiris. They thought that if the advisory was prompted by this sense of threat, was this threat for outsiders only? Are the locals safe?
Was there any confirmation or denial of this intelligence that India said it had from Pakistan?
Not immediately, but today I was watching Pakistan's foreign minister saying that India is unnecessarily building tensions along the border. But there was no specific or categoric denial of the allegations which were leveled by the Indian armed forces.
Riaz Mazwar Khan. Microalgae are one of the commonest and simplest of life forms, literally pond life, but scientists say they have huge potential for farmers because of their immense nutritional properties. Our correspondent in France, Hugh Schofield, has been to Brittany, where what will be Europe's biggest microalgae factory is now in operation.
Imagine a factory space filled in every direction by Perspex tubing, 80 kilometres of it, and all that tubing filled with a luminous green liquid, gradually making its way round to where it's compressed and siphoned off. That is how you make Chlorella vulgaris, an extremely basic organism that happens to be, in some people's minds, the key to a future revolution in world farming. In the tubes of the bioreactor, nourished by light and carbon dioxide, the microalgae simply multiply themselves by a constant splitting of cells. The factory is run by LDC Algae, whose founder is René Jean Guillard.
La chlorelle, c'est un bijou de la nature.
Chlorella is a jewel of nature. It's a concentration of vitamins, which we can use as feed for animals to improve performance, or we can apply it to plants and reduce our dependence on some of the chemicals we use today.
The nutritional properties of chlorella are well known. In Japan, it's used as a dietary supplement for humans, but this industrial level of production is for farming. Rich in protein and amino acids, when added to animal feed, it increases the efficiency of the animal's digestion. Sprayed on vines or potato leaves, it reduces the need for fungicides. René Jean Guillard believes in a greener approach to the soil, and this mega microalgae farm is actually the byproduct of an even bigger project which will eventually see hundreds of tons of Brittany pig slurry converted into compost, thus cutting the dependence on chemical fertilizers. But what he isn't is a dreamy eco-warrior. Large-scale farming, he says, remains the way forward.
Ça va être difficile de nourrir la planète avec
It's going to be hard to feed the world with 2 chickens and 3 cows in a field. The intensive model is perfectly legitimate, as long as it respects nature. We're always going to need agricultural systems and processes that are large in scale, but quality and nature must be applied to them too.
Chlorella vulgaris is an organism that first appeared on Earth 2.5 billion years ago. It's the stuff at the very bottom of the food chain, so tiny it's eaten by plankton. Now we're making it in factories and hoping it can help feed the world.
Hugh Schofield. Sport now, and Lionel Messi has been banned from international football for 3 months. The Argentina captain has also been fined $50,000 after accusing the governing body of South American football, CONMEBOL, of being corrupt. I asked our South America football correspondent, Tim Vickery, to remind us of what exactly Messi had said.
Recently, we had the Copa America, the South American Football Championship, played in Brazil. Argentina were eliminated 2-0 by the hosts, Brazil, in the semi-final. Perhaps didn't get the rub of the green with refereeing decisions. And Messi, after the game, accused the authorities of corruption, said, we don't have to be part of this corruption. Now, Lionel Messi, you don't usually get much out of him. He's a little mouse, but he became the mouse that roared with these comments, and perhaps roared somewhat unwisely. That C word, Emilio, corruption, that's very sensitive to the South American authorities. You may remember the FIFA-gate financial scandal 3-4 years ago. That was basically a scandal of the Americas, of corrupt football practices in South and Central America. And that's done huge damage both to the prestige and the finances of CONMEBOL, the South American Confederation. So to have their main star then accuse them of corruption in this so public manner, that clearly couldn't avoid punishment. Messi had apologised for his comments. He said they were made in the heat of the moment, but clearly he had to suffer some kind of punishment for using that sensitive C word.
And that sensitive C word is going to cost him 3 friendlies. What's the reaction been like in Argentina?
Yeah, probably 4, and there are 2 friendlies in September and 2 in October. The second opponent in October hasn't yet been sorted out. The other ones are Chile, Mexico and Germany. In fact, in Argentina, there's a sense of relief because these are only friendlies. They're fairly low-key friendlies. The competitive stuff starts again next year. World Cup qualification starts in March, and there's another Copa America co-hosted by Argentina and Colombia in June and July of next year. So Messi is free to play those those games. He'll miss one of them for a red card that he picked up during the Copa America. But I think there's a feeling of relief in Argentina that, yes, he's been punished, but no, he won't miss anything important.
Tim Vickery in Rio. Preparations are well advanced to celebrate 250 years since the birth of the German scientist and thinker Alexander von Humboldt. During his lifetime, he was incredibly famous and strongly influenced the work of Charles Darwin and others, but he then fell out of favor. Historian Andrea Wolf has written a biography highlighting the achievements of this German scientist and explorer.
Alexander von Humboldt was a German explorer and scientist. He was born in the same year as Napoleon, 1769. He lived to be almost 90, and he went on a 5-year exploration of Latin America, which was a journey that very much shaped his life and his thinking, that made him famous. And he was someone who came up with a new concept of nature, and a concept of nature that still very much shapes our thinking today. So he came up with this idea that nature is a web of life, that it's an interconnected whole where everything hangs together. And he also warned that humans have the power to destroy nature. So he warned already in 1800 of harmful human-induced climate change. So he was a pretty prophetic man.
And you say that he was famous back then. He was very influential on other scientists and thinkers at the time as well.
Yeah, so he was actually the most famous scientist of his age, which is kind of difficult to understand now. When his 100th birthday was celebrated, there were parties across the world, like 25,000 people marched through New York, for example. He influenced people like Charles Darwin. So Darwin said that he would have never boarded the Beagle without Humboldt. He was known across the world.
But what's really tragic about this is that he then gets forgotten, or deliberately even perhaps sort of rewritten or written out of the history books, because of what then happened in the next century with the war in Europe, World War I, and then obviously World War II. And there was a lot of anti-German sentiment about that. Is that part of why he's been left out?
That's part of the reason, but I would actually argue that what is more important is that there's no one big discovery connected to Humboldt's name. So he did not come up with a theory of evolution, for example, or discovered a planet or something like that. He came up with something that we've taken now so much for granted, like this idea that Earth is a living organism.
Well, you've written about him before, and now you've come up with this amazing book, which we have in front of us. This is The Adventures of Alexander von Humboldt.
It's a very lush, illustrated book, and Humboldt's legendary South America diaries had been a private ownership. They were bought in 2013 by an archive in Berlin. It was the first time that I saw them that I realized these 4,000 crazy pages with like lots and lots of drawings and sketches. I really wanted to do something that showed this. So this is a book that is inspired by Humboldt's own drawings, manuscripts, engravings, maps. His life really reads like an adventure story. He is this absolutely crazy guy who, comes from an aristocratic Prussian family and kind of gives up his life of privilege to go on this mad journey where he spends 5 years in Latin America and he paddles down the Orinoco and deep, deep in the rainforest when no white people really went. He went up the Andes, he climbed Chimborazo, which was then believed to be the highest mountain in the world, more than 20,000 feet high. He risked his life again and again, all in this pursuit to understand how the world hangs together. And he experiments on his own body. He experiments with electric eels. He drinks the deadly curare poison. and it was just fun, just concentrating on the adventures rather than on how he, over the next decades, kind of worked through the material he had collected in Latin America.
Historian Andrea Wolf speaking to my colleague, Rebecca Kesby. And that's all from us for now, but there'll be an updated version of the Global News podcast later. And if you want to comment on this edition or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. I'm Emilio Sampedro. Until next time, goodbye.